Coral Pasisi.
Mr. President, Secretary General and fellow briefers, Honourable Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is a privilege to present to you at this very important debate on sea level rise and the implications on international peace and security. Let me also thank the Government of Malta for inviting me to brief you from a CSO perspective. My experience is heavily informed from a SIDS lens, in particular the Pacific Islands, from whence I was born, have worked and lived my whole life to date, and intend to do so for its remainder. By 2050, within the lifetime of our children and grandchildren, sea level rise will have exceeded at least 1 metre for most SIDS, and this will last for thousands of years. In addition, the current 1 in 100-year extreme sea level event will be experienced every single year. Of course, there are many other scary projections as well, but even just because of these ones alone, sea level rise and climate change impacts present both a direct security threat as well as a threat multiplier to individuals, communities, provinces, nations, and certainly to our region as a whole, the Blue Pacific continent. Regardless of whether this is acknowledged by any international body or individual state, does not change that fact. A threat to one's security is best defined by the lens of those who are impacted, not by those who continue to be most responsible for its cause. The point at which the threat of sea level rise and climate change becomes so severe that it is deemed a peace and security threat for every single country in the world is only a matter of time and scale. For many SIDS, this reality is already upon our shores, and for some it has already washed them away. So how serious is the threat of sea level rise and climate change to statehood and the security of SIDS? The certainty of jurisdiction is what enables law and order and supports the upholding of peace and security. It is well understood how much conflict can arise because of the ambiguity of which islands belong to which nations and the boundaries that define this in the sea. The Blue Pacific continent is well known as a quilt of geopolitical interests, forged through the world wars, patchworked via the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and coloured by globalisation. It is now threatened to be torn by the impacts of sea level rise and climate change. This will only be exacerbated by the uncertainty of jurisdiction, as law remains ambiguous about the impacts of sea level rise on the base points by which exclusive economic zones are measured and fixed, and the continued flouting of responsibility and impunity in failing to act to stop climate change, despite clear evidence of the existential threat it poses to many states, communities, and individuals' human rights the world over. This is a security issue of paramount importance to the Pacific region and its nations, and is why Pacific leaders have developed the following critical declarations. In 2018, the Boe Declaration on Regional Security, which elevates climate change as the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of Pacific peoples. The 2021 Declaration on Preserving Maritime Zones in the Face of Climate Change-related Sea Level Rise, and the efforts of individual nations to reinforce this in sovereign law and policy. This declaration is our region's good faith interpretation of UNCLOS, noting that the relationship between climate change-related sea level rise and maritime zones was not foreseen or considered by the drafters of UNCLOS at that time. It is critically important that the international community, the UN system and UN members support this declaration and the individual island nations' efforts to secure their net statehood. Late last year, the 2050 strategy for a Blue Pacific continent was endorsed by Pacific Forum leaders. This strategy reinforces commitment and working together as a collective for advancing Pacific regionalism based on the Blue Pacific narrative, a lens which fully appreciates the threat of climate change to our security as a region, nations, communities, and individuals. And next month, hopefully, as championed by the people and government of Vanuatu and supported by all Pacific nations and a growing number of countries in the UN resolution requesting an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the obligations of states in respect of climate change. As the UN Secretary General noted last month, this is an opportunity for the ICJ to examine the conduct that has led the world to the brink of collapse and threatens every existence of countries, peoples, and cultures, as well as the human rights of individuals around the world. It is a critical piece of work to uphold our responsibility of doing our best to ensure intergenerational equity. So let me now turn to the realities of insecurity already happening in the most vulnerable countries and communities. Long before land goes underwater, it will become so degraded that it cannot support human life and the complex and critical ecosystems it once did. This is already manifesting across SIDS and coastal states. Coral reefs are bleaching, causing irreparable damage and affecting the vital food sources, livelihoods, and cultural fabric of coastal communities and countries. Seawater is seeping into delicate groundwater systems and threatens salination of drinking water and arable lands. The traditional knowledge and practice of Indigenous people, which constitute the vast majority of Pacific Island populations, is being lost as the natural resources upon which they are tied are being eroded by sea level rise and climate impacts. Early findings of the Pacific Security Outlook Report 2022 to 2023 reaffirm the complexity of these security implications for our region. And an ongoing climate security project funded by the UN Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund in the Pacific is assessing the security threat of our lowest lying atoll nations as the frontliners to the impact of sea level rise and climate change. At the top of those concerns voiced so far are food and water security, coastal erosion and land security, and the disproportionate impact on women, girls, and children. There are also unique non-economic impacts, and in many ways these are most concerning. A nation can be at war and its people still have hope and determination to survive. The war against climate change is quite different. The opponent is much larger, amorphous, and the ability to stop it is outside of your direct control. And whilst you can do your best to adapt with the limited resources you have, you continue to suffer loss and damage and fear for the future of your children. Despite this, SIDS remain resolute and amongst the most ambitious to lead by example, and their youth are defiant against being written off as the orphans of climate change. They are pushing for greater accountability of our generation to the next, whether we sit on a beach or in a glass tower. Intergenerational equity is a responsibility we must all carry, and one at the heart of the UN Security Council's mandate. So what then is the role of the UN Security Council in acting to address the threat of sea level rise and climate change to the security and peace of the world? In many ways, you have the greatest mandate and reason to address this issue because the fallout of failing to do so will fall directly in your remit of response. In our region, the increasing demand for concurrent law and order and defence responses is already straining preparedness and response capabilities. This is not just happening in developing countries either. New Zealand has just declared a national state of emergency because of the impact of extreme weather events hitting their country consecutively in a very short period of time. This is becoming an all too common occurrence across the world and is especially devastating to those least able to cope and respond. So what are the solutions? I don't think we have enough time to do that question justice here, but a great start would be to acknowledge and advocate to stop greenhouse gas emissions, targeting the root cause of this multiplicity of complex security threats. In addition, support the efforts of the regions and countries most at risk to secure their jurisdictional space on the planet and certainty of their existence as states into the future. Develop and implement ambitious policy on greening the practices of your own institution and its key bodies and stakeholders in the field. Wars are costly not just for people and nations, but also for the stability of our planet. Keep regularly appraised of the manifestations of sea level rise and climate change impacts by combining your efforts with other institutions undertaking site-specific risk assessments and developing appropriate responses. Go and meet in these places and fully appreciate firsthand the situation. Give voice to the most vulnerable, in particular women, girls, and children who are disproportionately impacted. This will help to inform your preemptive and proactive ability to cauterize as much of the potential insecurity and unrest before it becomes an issue so great that none of us can effectively respond. I thank you for listening.
Thank Ms. Pasisi for her briefing, and I shall